very classic, famous example of tool using in crows, which you might have heard about. Her name is Betty, Betty the Crow. Let's watch a video of Betty using a tool. So there's a worm in here. So she notices the stick isn't really working. And she's modifying it. So now the tool's more hooked. So there's like a little bucket that the worm was in, and she realizes she's trying with the stick, right? Can't get it. Goes and modifies the tool to make a hook, pulls it out. And this is commonly used as an example of showing that, look, this crow in particular had a causal understanding. We talked about causality last week. Had a causal understanding of the tool and the events, right? How else would Betty know that she needed to make a hook with the stick, right? If she doesn't have a causal understanding of physics, of object physics, and of how the events are linked together. Some people would still argue that this isn't necessarily complete 100% evidence of causal understanding, because on subsequent trials, she kept using a straight stick anyway. So what was going on there? Hard to know. Can't ask Betty. Do you have an understanding of the tool? No, you can't ask the crow, right? But it's something people argue about. Oh, I have it there twice for some reason. Don't worry about that. Okay. But this brings us back to this idea of causality and tool use. Causality and tool use. So do animals have a causal understanding that one event is causing another one? Or are they just kind of associating different events together? Is it just associative learning? Some would argue that this is kind of a pedantic discrimination, that a lot of the time associative learning has to happen to form causal understanding. Eventually associating events together, you might realize one is causing another, right? But others argue it's still a very important distinction. Just learning that two events are associated with each other does not necessarily mean an understanding of causality. So consider complex physical problems with tools. Okay? So for example, understanding why a hammer inserts a nail might help you understand why a hammer can break a window. Merely just associating hammer with nail doesn't necessarily mean you understand that hammer can also do other things, like breaking a window. Okay. So there is a difference. There is a difference between causal understanding and associative learning. They are linked together. They're not necessarily the same. So do animal tool users actually have causal understanding of what's going on? Okay, well, some experiments kind of try to look at this distinction, and they do that using a track tube task. Okay? So this is a pretty common apparatus used in these kind of experiments. Basically, you have this tube here, and there's a piece of food. Right here, okay? Piece of food. And depending on where you insert the tool, like a wooden dowel, you'll either have a failure or a success. So what does that mean? Well, if you push the tube through this way, if you have an understanding of object physics, of gravity, of causality, you'll realize that if you push it that way, at the top, it'll fall into this little trap, and you won't get the food. But if you push the tool through the other way, right, you get the food. So this is a very classic, important kind of paradigm in causality and tool use work. Of course, you need some experience, perhaps, with how to use this apparatus. But tool users can figure it out pretty well. Okay. So what do we find in those kind of classic examples of tool users? So chimps, capuchins, and New Caledonian crows can all learn to avoid the trap. But let's say you invert the trap. Okay, what does that mean, you invert the trap? So let's go look at the trap again. Okay. So if you invert the trap, you put the trap on top. So really, you can put the stick in either way now. There's no failure. Some would say if you have an understanding of gravity and of object physics, it shouldn't matter which way you put the tool in now, right? Okay. So when the trap is inverted, chimps and capuchins still avoid the hole. And some say, there you go. Evidence for associative learning, not causal understanding. Okay. There's problems with that, though. If you do the inverted task with humans, too, who we have, we're pretty sure we have causal understanding, right? They'll do the same thing as the chimps and the capuchins, because that's how they learn the task, so they'll keep pushing it in the same way. Might not actually mean they don't have causal understanding, it's just what they've learned to do, so they're going to keep doing it. It works that way, why would I start pushing the tool in the other way? So humans do that too. So it's not really a great piece of evidence that they don't have causal understanding. The other thing about the trap tube task that has been kind of a criticism of the task in general is that a lot of the time you have to push the food away from yourself, right, to solve the task properly. And that kind of becomes an issue of inhibitory control. Because to get the food, you have to first push it away. That might not have anything to do with causal understanding, but just wanting to bring the food. Okay, so it's not perfect. It's not a perfect task. They haven't really figured out a perfect task yet, to be honest. Okay. Transfer tasks. Okay. So will animals that learn to solve the trap tube task transfer their knowledge to a new task? That might have some kind of evidence of causal understanding, right? Okay, so what does that look like? Okay, so if you have a crow, this kind of classic trap tube task in A, you can see the trap here, right? You transfer it to a kind of similar task on a table. I think this is called a, what does it say? It's a table trap task, I think it's called. So a similar kind of problem, but slightly different. Slightly different. Will they transfer their knowledge the new task? Will they do better on the new task than animals who just did the trap table task without having experience on the trap tube task? What do they see? Well, on this experiment, not a whole lot of subjects, but it appeared that some animals could transfer their knowledge. So I think it was like 3 crows out of the 6 or something like that. You have to realize that these kind of experiments take a whole lot of training, take a lot of resources, take a lot of time. So if you got 6 crows, you got 6 crows. But it does appear from this experiment that some animals could transfer their knowledge and others couldn't. Okay. The fact that some can do it, though, is still useful information. All right. Another way to kind of study tool use in animals is to give them an array of tools to use. So there's kind of an example, a pixelated picture here. But these are different tools of different lengths, of different materials. So some materials might be harder, some might be more flexible. You can imagine it would be better to use a stick than a piece of yarn, right, to accomplish the trap tube task. So you can present animals with choices. So some that will accomplish the goal and others that will not, and see what they do. What tools do they pick? And again, there's a lot of variation. So species vary in whether or not they attempt to solve the task with the incorrect tool or immediately select the appropriate tool. So there's differences here. Okay. Didn't mean to keep this slide, ignore it. Alright. That happened again later. That happens again later. I took a slide out. Okay, so coming back to this question, do tool-using animals understand the physical and causal properties of tools, or are they just using associative and trial-error learning? Kind of talked about this a while ago with Thorndike's cats in the puzzle boxes. He realized that the cats were just engaging in trial and error learning, right? Are animals just trial and error learning, or are they actually understanding the causal properties of tools? So here are some important considerations to think about. Do the animals using the tool have prior experience using the tool? How do they do on transfer tests? That's a pretty good method. And when they're given a choice of tools, what tools do they pick? So think about these different characteristics when trying to understand if animals actually have a causal understanding of something or not. And, the results are kind of inconclusive on knowing if animals have causal understanding of what's actually happening. But there is certainly enough evidence to say that some tool users have some causal understanding. So kind of a wishy-washy conclusion, but that's kind of the truth. There's certainly enough evidence to say some tool users have some causal understanding. You can say that pretty confidently. Okay. Now we're going to end on one final little example here. 2 different examples. Again with crows. Okay, let's watch this.
Crows and ravens are the stuff of myths and legends. and according to some scientists, are among the smartest of birds, even more savvy than many mammals.
When you watch them, you kind of sense an awareness and alertness. Then you watch them some more and you see them play, engage in behaviors that seem to be made for the fun of it.
Dr. Van Heinrich of the University of Vermont has gone to great lengths to study these fascinating birds. More than a decade ago, he devised an experiment that demonstrated that ravens have the ability to make logical connections, much like human beings. Heinrich tied meat to a string and dangled it from a branch. It was a situation ravens would never encounter in a wild. But, as with this first-timer, some ravens figured out how to pull the string loose and anchor it with their claws, until the meat was theirs.
You couldn't have learned because I didn't train it. You couldn't have been programmed to do it evolution through millions of years because in the natural habitat you don't have that. And it couldn't have been random chance because there are too many individual steps. So it was very suggestive that the bird knew what it was doing.
Ravens exhibit other behavior that suggests innate intelligence. They will hide food for later consumption. And if one raven thinks another is watching, it will pretend to hide it in one place while actually hiding it in another. But the hoard of food is found and stolen. It's hard to outsmart a raven, even for another raven. They are, after all, very brainy birds.
I have some issues with some things said in that clip, but that's okay. I want you now to watch this clip. Some clips don't mind loading and other ones do. Oh. Small minorities solve the task spontaneously. Those ravens, they're just so smart. They're just as smart as bumblebees, apparently, right? Okay. So I'll leave your, you can leave that to yourself. Is this kind of the same or not? Seeing this string pulling in bumblebees, is it the same as the ravens pulling the string? There's clearly some similarities and some differences, of course. But it's not a crazy concept. The researcher said, oh, this would never happen in the wild, so they must have an understanding of what's happening. Okay, then you think the bees also have an understanding of what's happening. Right? We often kind of mystify behaviors that remind us of things that we do, and then we're like, wow, so smart, when this kind of thing actually happens in the wild all the time. This is kind of known as a killjoy explanation. You're killing the joy, but you're answering it with a simpler response, right? So I won't give too many of my opinions, but I will tell you to be wary of anthropomorphism. We often think of examples of animals using tools with the sticks to get insects as very intelligent, compared to, let's say, a hawk dropping rocks on clams. They're both kind of doing the same thing, extractive foraging. You could say there's a difference in tool manufacture, and that's fair. But just because a behavior is human-like, it doesn't mean it's more impressive than other behaviors. Every animal has its own evolutionary history that have shaped them to do amazing things. And they can do their own amazing things in their own ecological niches. But these are kind of sometimes known as killjoy explanations. And Sarah Shuttleworth, who is a pretty big deal in animal cognition, she's kind of like our queen, Sarah Shuttleworth. She wrote the optional textbook for this course. It's a very nice little book if you're interested, if you haven't picked it up. It's great. But she gives a lot of these explanations that are kind of less fun to things, but make a lot of sense. Okay, especially when it comes to tool use, be wary of anthropomorphism. We'll talk more about animal intelligence at the very end of the class and what I kind of think about calling animals intelligent. I think every animal has its own very impressive behaviors that they engage in based on their evolutionary history. And just because something seems human-like, it doesn't mean it's intelligent or not intelligent. But I'll talk about that more at the end of the class, but it's always nice to talk about when we're talking about tool use, where anthropomorphism happens a lot. So to respect the animal, don't try to make it into a little person. It's its own animal that can do its own incredible things. Okay. We're going to take a 15-minute break here, and then we'll come back at 2:35. Talk about concepts and categories.